They say I've lived too long alone up here on the mountain. That silence this deep must do something to the mind. But I've never minded the quiet. I didn't need anyone. And I was sure no one needed me, until one gray October afternoon, I saw something. Someone, standing between the pines. Tall, still, covered in dark gray fur. Not quite beast, not quite human. They didn't hide. They didn't speak. They just stood there, like they'd always been there, and I was the intruder. That night, I heard 3 knocks on the barn door. Steady, calm. Then footprints the size of shovels appeared in the damp earth. My dog, Burlap, stopped barking. He just stared into the forest, like he saw something I couldn't. There was no threat, just a presence. Testing me. I didn't ask questions. I left out hay, an apple, and a lantern. And when those things vanished, I didn't wonder why. But then, the woodpile was stacked. The broken fence fixed with vines. The forest trail swept clean. No words, just quiet, mutual understanding. One day, I found a smaller one, hurt, lying under a tree. It didn't cry, just looked at me with eyes that weren't wild. I brought it into the barn and dressed its wounds. That night, the larger one came close to the cabin. Didn't enter, just stood there, humming low, like strings dragging over wet stone. I didn't open the door, but I nodded, like a man accepting something he doesn't need to explain. By morning, the little one was gone, the blanket folded. And at my door, a silent circle of stones, no answers. But somehow I understood. Since then, every October, I light the lantern on my porch. Some years, the offering disappears. Some years, it doesn't. But each time, something is left behind. A stone not found in these parts. A handprint the size of a skillet pressed into the step. That last winter, when I couldn't leave bed, I dreamed of them. Gathered around me, not touching, just watching. One reached out, brushed my hair aside like a mother would. I woke to firewood stacked, water boiled, and a wreath of dry fern on the table, with words written in charcoal I couldn't read. But I knew what it said. We saw you. They found me 8 months later. The cabin untouched, the door unlocked. Burlap still lying by the step, his head resting, waiting, like he expected me to return from the woods. No one ever saw them again. No more knocks. Just one final line in my journal. If they come again, tell them I left the light on. It started with a silence, not the kind you pray for at night, not the kind that comes with sleep or peace or stillness. No, the kind that tightens around your ribs and makes the trees seem like they're listening. That was the kind of silence hanging over Fogback Ridge the morning it all began. Late October 1896. I remember it sharp, like the scent of chopped cedar and the crisp slap of cold air against the back of my neck. I'd been splitting logs behind the cabin since dawn, keeping rhythm with the crack and echo of my axe. Burlap, my old hound, had been sniffing near the woodpile, restless. He'd whined once or twice, low, almost like he didn't want to admit to being afraid. But when I turned to check on him, he was gone. Not far, just under the porch steps. Crawled there like he used to when he was a pup and the sky threatened thunder. Something wasn't right. I straightened up, wiped sweat from my brow with the inside of my flannel sleeve, and followed his gaze. That's when I saw it. Tall, taller than any man I'd ever known. Even back when I worked timber and met those Paul Bunyan types, covered in hair so dark it drank in the light. Standing dead still between 2 lodgepole pines just beyond the clearing. No crouch, no shift. It wasn't trying to hide. It was just there. My first thought wasn't fear. It was disbelief. The kind that knots behind your teeth when your mind can't quite grab on to what your eyes are feeding it. I didn't move. Didn't blink. It didn't either. Maybe a minute passed. Maybe less. The way time behaves when something ancient looks back at you. It stretches, bends, Then it turned. Not fast, not startled, just slowly rotated, like someone realizing they'd lingered too long in the wrong room. No rustle, no snap of twig. It walked away into the trees with the kind of grace I'd only seen in elk or ghosts. I didn't tell anyone. Wouldn't have mattered even if I had. Town was 4 days' walk, and I had gone in near a year. Folks down there barely remembered my name, and I was just as happy to keep it that way. That night I sat by the fire longer than usual. Burlap didn't touch his food. He stayed curled by the hearth, ears twitching every time the wind shifted. I'd almost convinced myself it was just a strange trick of light, just some hermit fur trapper cutting through the ridge on his own path. When it happened again, not a knock, not like that. 3 slow taps, on the cedar beam behind the goat shed, spaced out just right. Not loud, but deliberate. I froze, poker still in my hand, logs crackling low in the stone hearth. Didn't go out, didn't need to. That rhythm stayed with me all night, even after the sound was gone, even after Burlap's breathing leveled and the moon slid higher over the trees. Come morning, I went around back. The frost had started to crawl into the dirt, but I could still make out the impressions. Tracks, big ones, wider than my forearm, longer than a snowshoe. Deep, not just surface press like a deer or bear. Something heavy, something that knew where it stepped and didn't care if I saw. And right above the nails in the wood, snagged on the edge of an old splintered plank, was a tuft of dark, coarse hair. Too long for a bear, too rough for a horse. I ran my fingers through it. Dry, dense, smelled like moss and pine tar. That was the day I stopped pretending, stopped chalking up noises to wind or shapes to drink or fear to age. They weren't shy, just quiet and far too tall. I lit the lantern early that night, left it swinging from the hook beside the porch. Didn't know why. Just felt like the right thing to do. Felt like something had seen me. Like something was waiting to be seen back. And once you feel that, truly feel it, you can't unfeel it. The air doesn't go back to normal. The woods don't either. They change. Or maybe it's you who changes. All I know is the ridge didn't feel empty after that. Even when I was alone, even when the wind died, and not a single pine creaked, I could sense something just past the line of sight. Watching, maybe, or listening, or just being. There was no rush of understanding, no epiphany, just that same slow pull behind the ribs, like breath held too long. Whatever it was out there, it didn't want anything. Not yet. It just didn't hide. And that, more than anything, was what kept me up nights after. It wasn't a dream, wasn't madness. It stood between the trees and let itself be known. And no man walks the ridge the same after seeing that. Chuyanti benash, gianatapivema, nucho, shondang tip theo. Sometimes you look at the edge of the woods and think nothing's there. Just shadows and bark and wind. But then one night you stop pretending. You hold still. You stop breathing, and the tree line holds something in return. Not a threat, not a promise. Just a presence, waiting. The days got shorter after that first sighting. Nights settled in quicker than they used to, like the sun itself didn't want to linger up here anymore. I started noticing things. Subtle, quiet things that didn't shout, didn't scream. They just appeared like thoughts you didn't know were waiting for you. It was around the second week of November when the fence line by the goat pasture gave out. I'd built it myself maybe 7 years back. Rough cedar posts and split rails. Nothing fancy, but it held. That morning, I found the middle section toppled clean. Not cracked or bitten. Not trampled. Just uprooted. And not by rot either. The cedar was solid. But the post, it had been lifted. Not broken. Not snapped in half. Just pulled up straight from the dirt like a weed. And the thing is, there's no leverage out there. You'd need hands. You'd need precision. You'd need to know what you were doing. I looked around. Didn't see any prints. The ground was soft, a little muddy from the storm the night before. But whatever, or whoever, did it left no mess. That kind of cleanliness, it unnerved me more than any mess would have. Burlap hadn't been sleeping well. I'd hear him pacing most nights, claws ticking softly across the wooden floor, pausing by the door. He didn't bark, just those soft whines in the dark. Like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. Like something just outside the circle of light was waiting for the right moment. One night I sat up with him. I didn't even try to sleep. I poured myself half a cup of rye and turned the lantern real low. Around 2 a.m, I stepped out onto the porch. Cold air hit me in the lungs. I could see my own breath just hanging there like it didn't want to move. The woods looked normal, until I turned the lantern toward the tree line. That's when I saw them. 2 sets of eyes, red, reflective like how deer's eyes catch fire in the dark. But these didn't flicker. They didn't shift. They just stared, too high off the ground, too still. And then I noticed they weren't moving away. They weren't afraid of the light. They were watching the light, measuring it. I didn't raise the lantern any higher. Didn't want to startle them. Didn't want to dare them. I just stood there. And I whispered something I hadn't meant to say out loud. I see you. Maybe I was speaking to myself. Maybe not. Next morning I did something I'd never done before. I made an offering. I gathered up some dried clover from the shed, a few late-season apples from the root cellar, and tied them together in a bundle. I wrapped it in burlap, set it gently in an old wooden crate, and carried it to the base of the nearest pine, just before dusk. Then I hung a lantern above it. Not high, just enough to cast a warm, golden ring of light over the ground. It wasn't an invitation. It was an acknowledgement. I know you're there, the light said. And I'm not pretending anymore. I stayed inside that night, didn't sit up like before. But sleep didn't come easy. I kept listening for twigs breaking, for heavy steps, for breath. Nothing came. No sounds at all. But at first light, I checked the spot. The crate was empty, not tipped over, not chewed or scratched. Just empty. Apples gone. The burlap sack gone too. But the earth was clean. Clean in a way the forest never is. No boot prints, no claw marks, just dry, smooth pine needles, as if someone had swept them away with their hand. And one more thing. The rope that tied the crate shut. I'd knotted it in a simple loop. When I found it again, it was coiled neatly, tied into a triple twist I'd never seen before. No fraying, no tension, like it had been done slowly, with care, with intention. I held it in my hands for a long while, sitting on the porch with burlap at my feet. He didn't whine that morning. He just watched the woods. I didn't feel threatened. But I didn't feel safe either. It was something else, something like respect. They hadn't taken more than I had given. They hadn't left destruction or warning. They hadn't knocked again, hadn't broken the fence twice. That he'd accepted what I offered, and returned something I didn't ask for. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew it mattered. That day I started checking the tree line more often, not with a rifle, not with fear, with curiosity, with places where the pine needles had been shifted aside, not in lines, not by animal tracks, but in arcs, in patterns. And sometimes I'd find little things near the fence, stones arranged just slightly out of place, a stick propped up against a tree in a way wind couldn't do. Always subtle, always small enough to ignore. But I didn't. And neither did burlap. The strangest thing wasn't the fear. It was the feeling that something out there wanted to be understood, but didn't want to speak. Not yet. And every night I lit the lantern again. Didn't skip a single one. Because once you know something's there, once it knows you've seen it, the rules change. The silence shifts. The trees lean closer, and the darkness starts to feel deliberate. Some things out there don't need to walk into the clearing. They don't need to shout. You just feel them the moment you stop pretending they aren't watching. And by the time you realize that, they already know you saw them. It was the third week after the offering. Days had settled into a rhythm again, or at least what passed for normal up there. I started walking farther down the ridge during mornings, just past where the pine starts to thin and the creek winds its way through a bed of black stone and water-polished roots. It wasn't out of routine. It wasn't for food or firewood. I just needed to know if they were still watching. That day, it was colder than usual. Air dry and sharp, like it'd been scraped against the cliffs before blowing through. I had a snare line a half-mile from the cabin, stretched near a hollow where the rabbits usually ran. I brought my usual gear: knife, gloves, some smoked jerky in my coat pocket. Burlap didn't come. He stopped following me out there, like he knew something waited past the edge of what I was ready to see. I stepped across the creek, the same way I always did. One boot on the stone, one into the shallow bend where the water curved around like a silver ribbon. The current was lazy, but steady. It always made noise. That day, it didn't. That day, it felt like even the water had hushed itself. And that's when I saw it. Just on the other side, past the rocks and the dead logs slick with moss. It stood. Same height, same posture. Hair matted and dark like before. But this time it wasn't hidden. It wasn't in the shadows. It was out in the open, right beside the birch tree that hadn't turned gold yet. I don't know how long we stood like that. Could have been seconds. Couldn't have been longer. It didn't move, and neither did I. There was something different, though. I don't mean just in the air or in the silence. I mean in its eyes. It didn't look surprised. Didn't look afraid. It looked like it knew me, like it'd been waiting for me to see it fully. Then I noticed the wound. Right shoulder, near the collar. Not fresh. The fur was matted there, crusted in old blood, torn through like something bigger than tooth or claw had ripped it. Maybe a barbed wire. Maybe something sharper. It didn't flinch. It didn't ask. But that injury, it made something shift inside me. I pulled off my glove and reached into my coat. Unwrapped the old scarf I kept tied around an apple. It wasn't clean, not in the way a doctor would want, but it was wool, thick, worn from years of winter use. I didn't walk any closer. I didn't try to speak. I just set it down on a flat stone between us, the apple too. Then I backed away. Slow. Still, it didn't move. But when I turned around, it was already gone. I didn't hear it leave. Didn't catch the sound of branches snapping or leaves shifting. Just nothing. Like the wind had taken the shape of it and walked it off into the trees. When I got home, I didn't speak about it out loud. Not even to Burlap. But that night, I wrote it down. And for the first time, I didn't call it a thing. I wrote, "Today, I saw him again." His shoulder was torn, but his eyes were clear. Not animal. Not spirit. Just someone. Someone who remembers. That word. Someone. It stuck with me longer than I expected. I stared at it for a while, pen still in hand. I'd never used it before. Not for them. Not until that moment. The next morning, I went back to the creek. The scarf was gone. So was the apple. But in its place, the stone had been cleaned. Wiped. Like someone had run a cloth over it. A small pile of moss sat where the scarf had been. Soft. Damp. And not from rain. It was a gesture. Not a gift, maybe, but an answer. I didn't touch it. I didn't bring it home. I just nodded. Didn't know who I was nodding to exactly. But it felt right. That night, I didn't light the lantern. I didn't need to. The darkness didn't feel heavy. It felt settled. But sleep still didn't come easy. My mind kept circling around that look. The way he stood there, with the torn shoulder and the stare that saw right through me. It wasn't challenge. It wasn't fear. It was memory. And that did something to me. I've lived long enough to know the difference between being watched and being known. This wasn't the forest checking in on me. This was someone returning. And the strangest part? I felt like I'd been expected. I started thinking less about what they were and more about why they came back. The signs weren't random. The timing wasn't coincidence. These weren't the patterns of a wild thing. These were rhythms. Chosen, remembered. And in the quiet that followed that day by the creek, one thing became clear to me. They don't all come to haunt. Some come to see if we remember them too. I didn't mean to start lighting the lantern every night. It just happened, like a reflex you don't remember learning. I'd set it swinging gently from the porch hook, the old metal frame throwing soft amber light across the clearing. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to keep the dark honest. At first, I told myself it was for safety, habit, even comfort. But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't for me. It was for them. And they knew what light meant. The strange thing was, every morning after I left the lantern burning overnight, something small had changed. A pile of firewood stacked neater than I left it. Kindling gathered where none had been. Sometimes the woodshed door, which never quite shut right, would be pulled gently closed. Nothing showy. No threats. Just little things that said, "We see you." By the third week of lighting that flame, I stopped locking the door. I didn't feel foolish for it. Didn't feel brave either. It just felt right. Then came the storm. It rolled in fast from the northwest. Thick clouds pressing low and mean like bruises across the sky. The air snapped with static, and the wind smelled like wet rock and pine sap and something older than both. I brought burlap in early that evening, got the hearth going hot, and sat at the kitchen table with my boots still on. Rain came in sideways, loud. It battered the cabin like it wanted in. At some point, I must have drifted off. I woke to burlap barking, one sharp sound, just once. Then silence. Not silence like quiet. Silence like everything had stepped aside to make room for something bigger. I stood slow, walked to the front window. The lantern was still burning, and standing right beneath it, in the center of the clearing, was one of them. Not moving, not hunched, not hiding. Just standing there, in the pouring rain, arms loose at its side, face angled slightly down like it had nowhere to be but here. The water ran off its body in heavy sheets. The light caught in its wet fur, traced the edge of its shoulders and back like a painting come to life. I didn't know which one it was. Couldn't have been the one from the creek. Could have been another, but I knew it wasn't random. It had come to be seen. For 5 minutes, maybe more. It didn't move. Neither did I. I didn't breathe right. Didn't blink much either. Just stared through the rippling glass, the fire at my back barely warming my skin. There was something about the way it stood. Not threatening, not curious, but patient. Like it knew I needed time. And maybe I did. Then I walked to the hook near the door, grabbed the old wool coat I'd stopped wearing 3 winters ago. Gray, heavy, lined in sheepskin and patched more times than I could count. I opened the door. The wind slapped me, cold and wet and smelling like cedar and lightning. But the figure didn't flinch. I stepped out barefoot onto the porch, held the coat in both hands like I was holding out an offering to the dark. I didn't say a word. I just draped it over the top step, then backed inside. Shut the door. Didn't lock it. Didn't sleep either. Sometime near dawn, I heard the wind shift. The rain had softened to a hush, the kind that sits on the roof like a lullaby. I waited a while, then opened the door. The coat was gone, not dragged, not taken like something stolen, just gone. And on the doorknob, clear as day in the morning mud, was a print. Not a smear, not a handprint in the usual way. It was as if someone had pressed their palm against the wood just to feel it, to understand it. 5 wide fingers. Pads rough, no claw marks, and not a paw marks, and not a pause, more like a pause. A breath made solid. I stood there a long while, hand hovering over the mark, not quite touching it. I felt something move inside me. Not fear, not awe. Something quieter. Recognition. These weren't accidents. These weren't run-ins. Whatever they were, whoever, they were choosing to be here. They were responding. Observing. And now, reaching. That night, I lit the lantern again, brighter this time. And I watched the trees for a long while before going in. The firewood was full the next morning. The axe I'd left leaning against the wall had been oiled. Just lightly. Enough to keep rust off. None of this was loud. None of it asked for anything in return. But it meant something. It meant I wasn't imagining the connection. It meant I wasn't alone. And I started to understand. The light wasn't just a signal. It was a promise. Sometimes when you leave a light on, it's not to see your way through. It's to let someone else know they still have a place to go. Even if they never knock. Even if they never speak. It's a kind of language, older than words, written in flame and silence. And somewhere out past the tree line, someone was reading it. There was no wind that afternoon. Just a strange stillness, like the trees themselves were waiting. I'd gone out behind the barn to check a loose hinge when I saw something small and dark between the trees. At first I thought it was a stump, maybe a sack caught in the underbrush. But it moved, barely, and my chest tightened before my boots even started toward it. It was younger than the others, smaller, thinner, with shorter limbs and a rawness in its movement that didn't know how to hide yet. Its fur was thick and uneven, a dark brown with patches of dull black, and it clung to the base of a pine like it had become part of the trunk. I didn't call out, didn't speak. Its side moved in shallow jerks, like each breath hurt. That's when I saw the gash, fresh, running from its rib cage toward the back. Not fatal, but deep enough to leave it shaking. Its eyes didn't meet mine. They looked past me, toward the cabin. No fear, no hope. Just a kind of soft awareness, like it already knew the shape of what came next. I don't remember making the decision. I just remember bending down, slipping one arm under its knees and the other behind its back. Its body was warm, heavy with pain. It didn't struggle, didn't growl or scream. It let me lift it. The fur was wet with blood, not enough to panic me, but enough to know there wasn't time to think. I carried it across the clearing. Burlap stood at the porch, tense, ears low, not barking, just watching. I nodded to him. He didn't move. Inside, I set it down on the floor by the hearth. Not too close to the fire, not too far. I grabbed a blanket from the cot, laid it across the creature's chest. Careful not to press too hard. I didn't have bandages, just strips of old shirts and a bottle of clear liquor I hadn't touched since the last snow. It didn't make a sound when I cleaned the wound. Just breathed. Eyes half open now. Still not looking at me. Still looking toward the barn, toward the dark beyond the door. I don't know why that shook me more than the blood did. I sat beside it on the floor, knees stiff, hands shaking a little from the cold. I didn't say a word. Neither did it. There was no language between us, just something like presence, and maybe that was enough. Later, after the sun dipped low and the wind came back, I heard it. A sound I had never heard from them before, low, deep. From outside the cabin, maybe 20 feet from the wall. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a call. It was a vibration that moved through the floorboards, like a cello being played too close to bone. I didn't open the door. I didn't need to. Whatever was out there, it didn't want to come in. It just wanted to be near. I sat up straighter, hand over my chest. Not afraid. Not sure why, even now. Just something told me I needed to acknowledge it. So I did. I nodded. That's all I had to offer. It didn't come closer, but the sound faded. Softly. Like it had passed its message along, and the night could breathe again. I sat up with the young one for hours. Burlap curled at the edge of the rug, eyes never leaving the window. I dozed once or twice, but never fully. When morning came, it was gone. No blood trail, no broken latch, no busted window, just gone. But the blanket I'd laid over it was folded, neatly, square, placed exactly where I'd set it the night before. And the floorboards beneath it, damp with dried mud, like someone had stood there barefoot, just long enough to say goodbye. I didn't chase after it. I didn't leave the porch that morning. I just stood there, holding the folded blanket, staring into the tree line with something that wasn't quite sorrow, but close. Whatever had passed between us wasn't about rescue, wasn't about repayment. It was about place. That young one didn't look at me like a savior. It looked at me like a man who had something to offer. Not because I owed them, but maybe because I remembered what it felt like to have no place left to go. There are requests you never hear out loud. You just feel them in the air, carried on a glance, a silence, the way something looks past you instead of through you. And once you say yes to that kind of request, you can't go back to pretending you didn't feel it. You can't unsee the weight in a stranger's eyes. Even if that stranger never speaks, even if that stranger isn't quite human. They didn't come back after that night. Not for weeks. Not in the ways I'd gotten used to. No lantern shadows, no signs around the cabin. Just stillness. Deep, dry, winter-coming kind of stillness. But things weren't silent. Not really. There was a different kind of presence then. Something quieter. Like a breath just out of reach. I noticed it first on the trail heading north. That path cuts between the ash trees and down through the lower gulch, a place I hadn't cleared in years. Too many brambles. Too many deadfall limbs. It used to take me half a day to push through just to check the old traps. But on morning, I set out anyway. Just needed to move, clear my head, and I saw it. The trail was clean. Not flattened, not trampled. Swept. Low branches had been pushed aside, bent upward and looped with reeds like someone had known I'd be coming. The ground was free of loose stone. The moss had been peeled back from the path in wide, deliberate arcs, and strangest of all, every snare I'd forgotten out there, every rusted piece of wire or loop of twine I'd once set and lost track of, had been marked, with white stones, small, smooth, clean. Some stacked in pairs, some laid out in a crescent, not a pattern I recognized. But not random either. Someone had taken care not just to see where I'd been, but to leave something in return. I stood there for a long while, hand resting on the handle of the walking stick I hadn't needed in years. There was no wind, no birds, just me and that path, and the feeling that I wasn't the one maintaining it anymore. Later that same week, I went out to chop firewood near the ridge's edge. Cold had settled into the dirt by then, and the axe blade snapped clean through the logs like they were already halfway gone. I'd stacked maybe 20 pounds on the sled and started the slow drag back to the cabin. Halfway there, something in my hip went wrong. Sharp pain. I dropped the rope. The world tilted sideways. I must have blacked out for a second, maybe longer. When I came to, the sky had shifted, the wind had changed, and the logs were gone. No, not gone. They were sitting neatly by the side of my porch, stacked in perfect order, bark facing down to keep the wet out, ends a-lying tight like I'd done it myself, and I was lying flat on my back 10 feet closer to home than where I'd fallen. The grass under me was pressed in a curve, not like something dragged me by the arms, but lifted me from behind. The shape left in the dew wasn't jagged. It was smooth, arched, like a shoulder had been under me. I sat up slow, let the dizziness pass. There were no footprints, no scent, but I felt it. That same wordless presence, the one that didn't ask to be seen but made sure you noticed what they'd done. Later that night, I wrote in the journal again. Not much, just one line. They don't owe me, but maybe I owed the world one more act of softness. After that, I started leaving things out, not in exchange, not out of habit. Just small offerings. A folded knife, a tin of salt, one of the quilts my mother made back when I still thought winter was a thing you could outgrow. I never saw who took them. but they never vanished alone. Once, I left a hand mirror. Just a simple thing. Crack in the corner. I'd used it to shave in spring, hadn't touched it since. Next morning, it was gone. And in its place was a charm. A thing made of bark and reed and twine. No pattern I knew, but it held together strong, tightly wound, shaped like a teardrop with a stone at the center, like something meant to be carried in a pocket close to the heart. Other times, it was stranger. A spoon, worn smooth, carved from a wood I didn't recognize, a set of dried berries bound in leaves and twine. Once I found a stone, black and round. Still warm to the touch, even in frost. I didn't question the meaning. Not anymore. Some gestures aren't meant to be explained. Some just ask you to be present. I started leaving the door open a little at night. Not wide, just unlatched. Just enough to say, if you need warmth, there's a fire. I never heard footsteps. But every morning the woodpile stayed full. The latches never froze. And a feeling settled over me, like I'd become part of something older than fear, deeper than curiosity. Something not quite human, but not distant either. It didn't matter what they were. It mattered what they remembered, and what they chose to return. Sometimes, the loudest gratitude is a silence that makes your world gentler. A hand you never see that lifts you from the cold. A trail you didn't clear, but someone did, because they saw you trying. And maybe that's all most of us ever need. Not answers, not words. Just a presence that keeps the path open. Just in case we have the heart to walk it again. The snow came early that year. Sharp and dry, like glass shavings drifting from the sky. I'd stacked enough firewood by then to last most of winter. Maybe more if I was careful. The lantern kept burning after night, but no one came. No gifts. No moss bundles. No footprints circling the porch. I kept the door cracked just the same. Habit, I guess. Or maybe faith. Then, in mid-December, something in me shifted. It started slow. A cough I couldn't shake. Tightness in my chest that didn't go away with rest or tea. I thought it might pass like all the others had. Just another winter cold, creeping in through the seams. But it settled deep, like the frost in the bones of old trees. There were days I couldn't make it to the shed without leaning on the railing. Burlap knew before I did. He followed close, quiet. Eyes full of something I hadn't seen in him since he was a pup. Worry. Then came the fever, not all at once but in waves. Long stretches of sweat and shivering. My breath turned short. My skin thinned. Dreams blurred with memory, until I wasn't sure which was which. I'd wake and not know the time. The fire would be out or burning too bright. My journal lay untouched for days, maybe weeks. But I remember one night, clearer than the rest. A low wind curled around the cabin like a whisper. The kind of wind that comes from no direction you can name. I was flat on my back, too weak to lift a glass from the table. Burlap lay by the door, unmoving, but not asleep, just watching. And then I saw them, 4 shapes, tall, still, standing in the corners of the room where the firelight didn't quite reach. Not shadows, not illusions. Solid. They didn't move. Didn't breathe, but they were there. I wasn't afraid. I should have been. One of them stepped closer. Only one. She knelt beside the cot. Her hand was massive, fur-covered, fingers thick as branches. Yet gentle. She reached forward, slow, and brushed the hair from my forehead, like how my mother used to when I was too young to understand the meaning behind the gesture. That simple act, soft and human and ancient, it broke something in me. I didn't cry. Couldn't, but I let myself go. I let the silence take me. And when I woke, it was morning. The fire was lit. The kettle was warm. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar and ash and something like fresh bark. Burlap still lay by the door, eyes open, head up. but the shapes were gone. What remained was a ring of dried ferns set carefully on the kitchen table. Woven tight, tied with a single strand of gray hair, coarser than mine, not from a human head. It wasn't a wreath. It wasn't decoration. It was a message, and beneath it, in smudged strokes of black charcoal, was writing. Not in English. Not in any language I'd seen. But I understood. 4 words. We saw you. Still. That's what it meant. I knew it in my chest. Not translated, felt. The ridge hadn't forgotten me. I don't remember standing. But somehow, I found myself on the porch, wrapped in my blanket, watching the tree line. Snow drifted down in lazy spirals. The air held no weight. I looked into that frozen distance and felt the strangest thing. Not watched, not judged. Held. Held by something too big to fit in words. Too kind to demand thanks. Too old to ask permission. I didn't light the lantern that night. They didn't need it anymore. They knew the way. And I knew they'd come if I ever asked again. Some places don't forget the ones who move gently through them. Some forests remember every step, every offering, every silence shared like prayer. And when the cold comes, when the body starts to slip and the breath comes shallow, they come back. Not as ghosts, not as monsters, but as witnesses. Because kindness, even the quiet kind, echoes louder than most men believe. I reckon I always thought it would happen in the spring. The leaving part, I mean. Not that I ever circled a date or laid out plans for it. Just something in me figured if the end had to come, it ought to be when the creek thawed and the moss lit up green again. When the sky cracked open for light and the birds came back singing like they never left. Something soft like that. And it did. They say I went in my sleep. That part I wouldn't know. But I hope it's true. I'd like to think the fire was low. The dog at the door. The wind slipping soft through the boards like it had done for years. No struggle, no noise. Just an exhale that didn't bother to come back. No one found me for 8 months. That's the way of things when you live out here. By the time the park men rode up, the world had already made its peace. Nothing out of place, nothing broken. The windows still whole, the chimney still drawing clean. The tools hung neat along the back wall, just like I left them. But there were other things. Things that didn't make sense to the men who came looking. The cabin hadn't gathered dust. No cobwebs. No rodent scratchings under the floorboards. Not even a broken hinge or leaf pile against the door. The woodpile was stacked high. Fresh cut. Clean. A bowl of water sat near the hearth. Still full. And Burlap. My old boy, he was there. Still on the porch. Curled up beside the steps. Not guarding. Not asleep. Just watching. Like he always had. Only now, his eyes were closed for good. They buried me up the hill near the 2 white pines where the sun falls long across the ridge in the evening. Marked the spot with a flat stone. Didn't carve a name. Just a circle. A ridge inside a ridge. I would like that. But it's what they found on the porch that stuck. 7 stones, laid out in a line across the front step. Flat. Smooth. Gray. Placed with a gap between the 6th and the 7th. Not a barrier, not a fence, a sentence. Like the start of something spoken, but never finished. Like someone wanted to remember, but not explain. Inside the cabin, they found my journal. Most of it was mundane. Weather patterns, crop notes, reflections on the creek in the shape of the fog as it came down off the trees. But not once, nowhere, did I write the word Bigfoot. Not a single time. Because that's not what they were, not to me. There was no need to name them. No use chasing the comfort of definition. Some things grow clearer when you stop trying to hold them down with letters. But on the last page, written in pencil, pressed soft so the graphite barely clung to the paper, I left a line. 1 line. If they come again, tell them I left the light on. That's all. No signature. No goodbye. Just that. And I meant it. Because whatever walked those woods, Whatever waited in the shadows beyond the tree line, it was never just watching. It was remembering. It was choosing. And I had been chosen. Not as a prophet, not as a savior, just as a witness. A keeper of the flame. A man who said yes when the forest whispered need without a voice. That cabin never really belonged to me. Not fully. It was theirs, too. It always had been. And now that I'm gone, I like to think they still pass through, quietly. Without sound, checking the stone ring out front, nudging the door to see if it gives, watching the sunset from where the lantern used to hang. Not because they have to, but because they remember. Because sometimes, the only thing a place needs to stay sacred is to know someone once listened, really listened, and left the light burning just in case. Some goodbyes aren't loud. They don't echo. They don't weep. They just stand in the dusk beside the trees and wait for you to know they were there. Not for thanks, not for answers, just to be seen, one more time, by someone who saw them first. There are stories that don't end so much as they settle, like dust after a long wind, like warmth that lingers after the fire goes out. They're not about the loudest voices or the grandest gestures. They're about presence. About what it means to simply be there, to see and be seen, even if no words are ever spoken. This was never a tale of monsters or myths. It was about something quieter. Something that lives between the spaces people tend to ignore. The pause between knocks, the flicker at the tree line, the stillness just before dawn. It's in those spaces that we find the parts of ourselves we forget to tend to. The part that listens before judging, that gives without asking, that leaves the door open just a little. Not because we expect someone to walk through, but because we want them to know they can. Sometimes the deepest connections don't come from understanding. They come from allowing mystery its place, allowing another soul. No matter how different, how distant, to move beside us in silence, and knowing that silence doesn't mean absence. That just because something doesn't speak our language doesn't mean it has nothing to say. Out beyond the noise of the world, beyond the headlines, and the shouting, and the endless need to name things, there are still places where kindness is a trail you leave behind, where memory is carved not in stone but in gestures. A coat left on a step, a light kept burning, a path cleared of branches simply because someone might need to walk it. And maybe that's enough. Maybe we don't need to have the full picture. Maybe we don't need proof. Maybe it's the choosing to believe in something gentle, something watching, something that remembers us when we're gone. That makes all the difference. Thank you for walking this ridge with us. If this story stirred something quiet in you, if it made you feel just a little less alone in the dark, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know what part stayed with you. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories that don't shout, but stay, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll keep the light on.